The air inside the restaurant was thick with the aroma of sizzling garlic and butter, the sharp clatter of knives against chopping boards, and the low hum of conversations from eager customers. It was another busy evening, and Chef Daniel had no time to pause. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, scanning the kitchen with a trained eye, ensuring every plate that left his pass was flawless. But then, something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. A young woman stood, hesitantly near the entrance, her hands clasped together, eyes darting across the restaurant as if she was searching for something, or someone. There was something eerily familiar about her, though Daniel couldn't quite place it. She wasn't just another customer. No, there was a quiet determination in her stance, the kind that only comes from surviving something unimaginable. And then, in an instant, it hit him. Years ago, she had stood in this very spot, not as a confident woman, but as a lost, broken girl. 13, alone, pregnant, and unwanted. Daniel remembered the way the entire town had whispered about her back then, how she had been kicked out of her home, abandoned by those who should have protected her. A child, forced to grow up overnight. He had never forgotten the way she had looked on that cold winter night, shivering in the doorway, too scared to ask for help, but too desperate to leave. Back then, he had done what he could, given her a warm meal, a little money, and a few words of encouragement. But in a world that had already turned its back on her, it wasn't enough. Now, she was back, but this time, she wasn't just a girl in need. She was someone different, someone stronger, someone who had returned, not as a victim, but as a force, to be reckoned with. And whatever she was about to say next was about to change everything. Daniel's grip tightened on the edge of the counter as he watched her step forward. The restaurant buzzed around him, waiters hurrying between tables, the sizzle of hot pans in the kitchen. But for him, the world had suddenly narrowed to just her, the girl from years ago, the girl who had walked out of these doors with nothing, swallowed by a city that had no mercy for someone in her position. She finally met his gaze, and when she did, Daniel saw it, the fire in her eyes, the quiet strength, the unspoken history that had shaped her. She wasn't here for pity. She wasn't here to beg for anything. No, she had come back with purpose. Do you remember me? Her voice was steady, controlled, but underneath it was something else. A test. Daniel exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said, nodding. I remember. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, just for a second, but then it was gone. She glanced around the restaurant, taking in the soft glow of the lights, the carefully plated dishes, the customers enjoying their meals. There was something unreadable in her expression, a quiet calculation. Daniel wasn't sure why, but he had the sudden, overwhelming feeling that she wasn't just here to revisit the past. She was here to prove something. Before he could say anything else, she took a deep breath. I need a job. The words landed between them like a challenge. Daniel blinked. He had expected her to say something about what had happened, about where she had been. But instead, she was here asking for work. After everything, she must have read the hesitation in his face, because she straightened her shoulders. I know what you're thinking, she said, but I've worked in kitchens before. I can handle it. Daniel crossed his arms. Where have you worked? Her jaw tightened. Places. That answer didn't tell him much, but the way she said it, it wasn't pride, exactly, but something close to it. She wasn't going to beg. Something in Daniel told him this moment mattered, that the choice he made right now would change everything. He had a dozen questions, 100 things he wanted to ask, but instead, he found himself nodding. Trial shift. Tonight. His own words surprised him. but he didn't take them back. "You mess up. You're out." For the first time since she walked in, something close to a smile touched her lips. Fair enough. And just like that, she stepped behind the counter, tying an apron around her waist like she had been there all along. At first, the kitchen was against her. "Who is she?" one of the line cooks muttered. "A newbie, middle of a rush?" Another scoffed. "Not a chance." Daniel heard them, but he didn't interfere. He wanted to see how she handled it, and then she moved, not with the awkward hesitance of someone who didn't belong, but with the sharp, precise motions of someone who had spent years learning in silence. She slipped between stations, dodging boiling pots and swinging knives, hands steady as she grabbed ingredients without being told. It didn't take long for the whispers to change. "Did you see that? She just plated that faster. Then, okay, maybe she knows what she's doing." Daniel watched, a strange mix of pride and curiosity stirring in him. Who had she become in the years she was gone? But then, something happened. She was reaching for a knife when someone brushed past her too quickly. Her fingers barely missed the handle, and instead of catching it, the knife clattered loudly to the floor. The whole kitchen went still. Daniel saw it happen. How for just a second, her breathing changed. How she looked at that knife, like it was something more than just an accident. Like it was a memory she couldn't shake. Then, just as quickly, she pushed past it, bending down, grabbing the knife, and continuing as if nothing had happened. But Daniel knew better. There was something there, something dark, and he was starting to realize. She hadn't just come back to work. She had come back for something else. Later that night, when the kitchen had quieted and the last dish had been sent out, Daniel found her cleaning down a station, her movements methodical. "You did good," he said, leaning against the counter. She looked up at him, searching his face, like she was trying to figure out if he meant it. "Thanks," she said simply. He crossed his arms. "Where have you been all these years?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she exhaled. "Everywhere." That wasn't enough for Daniel. He had seen too many people walk through life carrying ghosts. He wasn't going to push, yet, but he knew there was more to this story. And something told him. Whatever had brought her back here wasn't just about cooking. It was about facing something or someone, and when the truth finally came out, it was going to shake everything. Daniel didn't press her for more. He knew better than to force someone to open up before they were ready. But deep down, he could feel it. Something big was coming. He had seen it in the way her hands hesitated for just a fraction of a second. When that knife fell, he had heard it in her voice, in the way she said, "Everywhere." Over the next few weeks, she became part of the kitchen. Not just another pair of hands, but someone people respected. She didn't just work hard. She worked like she had something to prove. Like every perfectly plated dish, every smoothly run shift, was another step towards something bigger. And then, one night, everything changed. It was a busy evening, the kind where no one had time to think. Only move. Orders flew in faster than they could go out, and the heat from the stoves made the air thick. But she was in her element, calm, focused, until she saw him. Daniel didn't notice at first, but when he followed her gaze, he saw a man sitting at the far end of the restaurant. He was older now, with graying hair and tired eyes, but there was no mistaking who he was. Her father, the man who had thrown her out all those years ago. Daniel felt the tension in the air shift. She stood frozen for just a moment, gripping the counter so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Then, without a word, she untied her apron and walked straight toward him. The restaurant seemed to quiet. as she stopped at his table. The man looked up, and for a second, he just stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. "You're back," he said. Finally, his voice uneven. She nodded. "I am." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had never been said. "I heard about what you've done, the places you've worked, the people who respect you." He swallowed. "You built something." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him. The lines on his face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his glass. He wasn't the same man who had kicked her out in anger, convinced she had ruined her life. He was older now, maybe wiser, maybe filled with regret. "I did," she said at last. "I built something. Without you." He exhaled slowly, nodding as if he had expected that answer. "I was wrong." It wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was the closest thing to one she was ever going to get. She could have walked away, could have held on to the pain, the years of struggle, the nights spent wondering if she would ever be okay again. But instead, she did something even more powerful. She let it go. Not for him, but for herself. She nodded once. Then, just as calmly as she had walked over, she turned and left him sitting there, alone with his past. Back in the kitchen, Daniel watched as she retied her apron, took a deep breath, and stepped back onto the line as if nothing had happened. But he saw it, the weight that had lifted, the quiet peace that had settled into her expression. She wasn't that 13-year-old girl anymore. She was something more, and as the night went on, as the orders kept coming, and the kitchen stayed alive with movement, Daniel knew one thing. For sure, she had won. Not by seeking revenge. Not by proving anything to anyone but herself. She had come back stronger. And that, more than anything, had left everyone speechless. And just like that, the past was behind her. And the future, that was hers to decide.